Welcome back to the Aussie Shed, ladies and gentlemen, for another one of my technical videos. And today I'd like to talk about gear shifters, and in particular short shifters, covering both kinds, which is short throw shifters and just a shortened shifter. Now, I'm following on from a video I did last week on rebuilding my Nissan Z32 300ZX's shifter. It's a factory shifter, all stripped apart, rebuilding it, new bushings, etc. If you've seen the video, good on you. So this is the shifter that I will be using for this this demonstration, and what we will be talking about. As you can see, what I've got drawn out here is a representation of this shifter. It's a 1:1 scale. So all of the measurements I will be speaking about will be something that you should be able to get a bit of a gist of in the real world. So what you can see here are some of the major measurements that we need to talk about when we're talking about shifters. We've got the length of the shifter from the top to the center of the pivot ball. Obviously, top of that, the center of that. And we've got the center of the pivot ball to the center of the linkage arm down here. Now, the relationship between this measurement here and this measurement here is called the motion ratio. So to get the motion ratio, what you have to do is you have to divide this number, 40 millimeters, into 220 millimeters. So our motion ratio equals, oh, I've just got to be careful I don't rub me bloody marker off here. Alright, so we've got 220 divided by 40 equals 5.5. Yes, I am a khaki hander. We'll just move that over there. Alright, so we've got a motion ratio of 5.5 to 1. 5.5 to 1. Now, that motion ratio, 5.5 to 1, that's what the factory, now whichever factory made this shifter originally for whatever vehicle, that's what they've determined to be a comfortable throw that properly moves these selectors over the synchros and selects the gears at a speed and a ratio that's comfortable to use, and selects the gears well enough that it's not something that you will ever have issues with. So what happens when you start dicking around with the motion ratio like this? So what you do when you're doing a short shifter, a short throw shifter, is you change this measurement here, this 40 millimeters. So what you do is you either move the pivot ball up or you bring the linkage location down. So to get a short throw shifter, what you have to do is move these two things apart. So that's what you'll commonly see with a short throw shifter, is this length here is different. Generally the gear shifter will still be the same length, but this will be different. Okay, a standard thing to do with a short throw shifter, and I know with the 300ZX, the rough length that you can get by with is about a 20 mil extension down here. And that's generally what you'll often get with shifters. They all vary, depending on who makes them and all that sort of stuff. So let's see what happens if we change that to 60. So then we have a new motion ratio. So if we take our 220, divide it by 60, we've got 3.66. So we've gone from a factory motion ratio, 5.5 to 1, to a new motion ratio of 3.66 to 1. Alright, so now that we've got a bit of a baseline here to work with, how does that affect our shifter and the feel of the gear stick and the way we change gears and all that sort of stuff? Alright, so we'll mark the center line of the shifter down here, and let's assume that when we shift gears in this manner, forward and backwards, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, all that sort of stuff. The shifter at the bottom moves 20 millimeters on each side. Now this actually will never change in relation to this length here of what you do with your short shifter and how much you spread the pivot ball and the pivot point apart, because it always takes 20 millimeters movement either side of neutral to activate your selectors, etc. I'm not saying it is 20 millimeters, but we're just using that as a rough measurement. So what that in turn means is, due to the motion ratio, our shifter at the top moves about 110 either side of neutral to shift with the shifter. Again, not saying that's how far it moves, but you know, we're just sort of using nominal measurements here, and these measurements are a little bit accurate because we are rotating around a circle, so these measurements will change in relation to the distance from the center of the pivot ball to that where they fall in the circles, but it's close enough. It's close enough so you get the gist of this. So if we now change our length down here to 60 millimeters, the length from the pivot point to where our linkage attaches, we then get a new travel distance up here of 73 millimeters. So you can see how that has changed and how much that's changed our shifter throw. So then we have a short throw shifter. So now you've only got to move it a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there. But the big trade-off now, guys, is you have lost a certain amount of mechanical advantage, because the lower your motion ratio or mechanical advantage number is, the less mechanical advantage you have. For example, if you're if that's 1 to 1, well then you've got the same amount of force applied to move one end as the other. So you start off with a 5.5 times to 1 mechanical advantage, and by extending the length of the pivot point by 20 millimeters, you've now reduced your mechanical advantage to 3.6 to 1. And what you're also doing by doing that, if you're moving this end of the handle at the same speed to do the shifts, you've actually then increased the speed that this end moves. So you've gained a lot of speed in how quickly that shifter moves across. Now, so your transmission may or may not be able to be shifted quicker than it is normally. So you may find that even using a normal shifter, if you're trying to change gears really fast, you'll get a bit of grinding because your synchros really don't like engaging at that amount of speed that the shifter's pushing everything across on all of the shafts. Well, you're now in a situation where even at a shift at normal speed is moving this faster, which may create problems. You may start to suffer from not being able to get the thing in gear because you've lost mechanical advantage. And again, part of that could be due to the fact that this end is moving faster than it was originally. There are also other things that come into play with this, like the mass of your flywheel and clutch pack assembly, the RPM that you are shifting at. All that sort of stuff is very well thought out by the factory when they design the shifter, and by changing any of the parameters, you are meddling with the way that it is designed to work optimally. That may work fine, but as I say, all vehicles are different, and some people have a terrible time with their gear shifts once they start meddling with things like short shifters and stuff like that. So that's how a short throw shifter works. So you also just have a shortened shifter, which is where you just cut the gear stick down. But again, you are doing the same thing. By cutting the gear stick down, you're basically doing the same as extending the thing this way. So let's do a cut down gear stick scenario. So let's say we cut 50 mil off the gear stick. Alright, we'll do that over this side here. So our gear stick is now 170 millimeters. We've cut 50 mil off from 220. and we'll use the standard size at the bottom of 40 millimeters, which is our standard distance down here. We'll make that 40. So now we have a new effective motion ratio or mechanical advantage of 4.25 to 1. So we're kind of in the middle of the two now. So our standard ratio was 5.5 to 1. Extending the pivot ball 20 mil gave us 3.66 to 1. Shortening the gear stick 50 mil with a standard pivot ball position gives us 4.25 to 1. That also reduces the amount of movement in the shifter at the top. And the movement with this setup is again in the middle, and it is around roughly 85 millimeters for your shift at the top. So you can see how this is all working now. The worst thing that you can ever do, and I do see people do this quite often, they have a short shifter. They've changed the length of the pivot point to the linkage attachment point by 20 mil, and they've also cut 50 mil off the gear stick. So let's change that again. Let's change this to, we'll leave that at 170, and we'll now make that 60. Okay, our mechanical advantage is now 2.83 to 1. So now you're in deep shit, guys. You've reduced your mechanical advantage with the shifter over the bit that you're trying to push on the end from 5.5 to 1 down to 2.83 to 1. And now our shifter, we'll make this the third one down here. Okay, so our shifter now, it only moves 53 millimeters. So basically, bit of this. But to move the shifter, you have to apply much more force. And again, every small bit that you move here, you're moving it a lot more down the bottom. So again, you are increasing the speed that this thing is being moved. You're then trying to force the selectors across so much faster over the synchros and everything to engage the gear. So this is where you're really going to have problems. So all in all, you can see that this, messing around with this sort of thing, you are potentially playing with fire. Now, lots and lots of people buy short shifters for their cars because they think it's a really trendy thing to do, that it's the coolest thing in the world to have a short shifter, only to put up with it for like 6 months and then just go, I hate this thing so much, it's so shithouse, I just want a standard shifter back. And then often they find they can't get them because so many people have chopped them up or gotten rid of them. They're a little bit hard to find. So in my opinion, guys, and I'm not saying this is for everyone, I'm not a fan of the short shifter. I'm actually a fan of the opposite. I'm a fan of the extended shifter, which really puts me at odds with most people in car world. Well, particularly those who are more into the looks and style of their vehicles. If you look at vehicles that are used in most forms of motorsport, they will generally have the gear stick, whether it is the factory gear stick or an aftermarket shifter or aftermarket transmission. They will generally have a longer gear stick, which moves the end of the gear stick closer to the steering wheel. Because what you want is you want to reduce the time between taking your hand off the steering wheel and going to the gear shift and then getting it back on the steering wheel. If you've got a tiny weeny button mushroom of a gear stick that you've got to go a long way to get, and then when you do finally get to it, it's very hard to accurately shift it because you have lost a lot of that precision. Even though people will claim the opposite and say, oh no, it's more precision. The problem is that you have to be so more specific because you've basically reduced the margin of error as far as where you are on the stick, and you've increased the amount of force that you need to apply. And again, even though you feel that you might be able to do these really sharp, fast shifts, you may not always find that's the case, as I say, due to the transmission just saying, you're not doing that with me, mate. So again, you've got the whole opposite problem. If you want to run an extended shifter, you once again want to try and keep the mechanical advantage and the motion ratio correct, so that you don't end up in a situation where you are creating these problems, speeding up or slowing down the movement of the linkage at the bottom, and increasing or decreasing the amount of movement of the shifter at the top. So ideally you want to create a situation so that you're somewhere around the factory specifications of what you had initially. The way that you achieve that, like obviously if you just extend the gear stick without changing the pivot point, you'll get the opposite effect happening. This will then increase. So that'll get bigger and bigger and bigger. So in essence, the gear movement will become sloppier. You'll have more and more and more movement the longer the stick is. So again, you can compensate for that in the way that you do with a short shifter, by changing the length of the pivot ball and the linkage attachment point, so that you end up with what you want at the top. So I'll flip this board over here and I'll just draw out a lengthened shifter now, just to show you how that works. Okie dokie. So now let's say we're interested in some form of motorsport and we want to extend the gear stick to get the position a little bit closer to our steering wheel. Alright, so we'll come up here. Alright, so that is our new gear stick length. Like so. Reason being, our steering wheel is here. Our steering wheel. And we want to reduce the distance between here to here and take it up to that much, to reduce the time it takes to get your hand off here and get to the top of the gear stick, change gears and get back onto the steering wheel. So the main priority, of course, is that we do not want to change this amount of motion or movement from what we had initially at the factory. We don't want this to be like driving a Mack truck. We want to keep it as it was from the factory, or maybe even tune it up a little bit if we feel we really need to do that. So our new overall gear stick length, let's say it's 280 millimeters. So we've added 60 onto that. Take that down to there. 280. And our original mechanical advantage was 5.5 to 1. So that we want to keep. And to do that, we need to change the length here to 50 millimeters. So again, basically the same thing. We need to move the pivot point. We need to open it up, but only by 10 millimeters. And that is worked out by dividing 280 by 5.5, 50 millimeters. Or 50.1, 50.9 to be exact. But thereabouts, like I say, these things, you know, you don't have to be working to a super level of precision. We're all just trying to sort of get in the ballpark. And what that will also do, that will maintain our 110 millimeter throw at the top of the shift, just like we did down here. That was also 110 millimeters. So we've maintained the same amount of throw. We've extended the gear stick up another 80 millimeters, and we've done that by increasing the length between the pivot center of the pivot ball and the center of the linkage attachment point down the bottom there. Now, if we want to reduce that a little bit there, again, we can play with these amounts here. If we want to reduce that even further, say if we want that to be, say 90 millimeters. Okay, so we now want, no, we've decided we're all good. We can we can go a little bit faster, and the gearbox is okay, but it doesn't like to be shoved too fast. But we can reduce this to 90 millimeters. Now, how does that affect the bottom down here? So, in order to work out what our motion ratio is, or our mechanical advantage here, we now need to divide 90 by 20. Alright, so 90 divided by 20 equals 4.5 to 1. So that is our new motion ratio, 4.5 to 1, 90 mil throw at the top. But in order to get that, how do we then adjust this? And now we simply get our 280, which is our new stick length, divide that by 4.5. Is 62, so it means we have to change this length here, center of the pivot ball to the center of the linkage, 62. And the good thing about doing this yourself, guys, is that as long as you maintain somewhere around your original throw, then the speed that your selector is moving is roughly the same as it was from factory, because these two numbers are tied together, and it's not actually the distance between the pivot ball and the center of your linkage point that makes a difference in your shift quality. It's mainly the fact that you are losing throw when you extend that without changing the size or the overall length of the shifter. So as you can see, guys, there's all sorts of trade-offs involved in doing this sort of modification. You've got to be always thinking about the speed of the shifting mechanism in the gearbox, the mechanical advantage, whether it is enough to make shifts comfortable, the length of the gear stick, and all that sort of stuff. So all in all, you can work with all these calculations and juggle things around until you get something that fits what you want. You know, you see how far you can push the movement of your gear shift linkage. You might only be able to go so far. You say, okay, well, I can only move that at X amount of speed, so therefore X amount of mechanical advantage, and again, shift length and all that sort of stuff. So I'll leave you with it, guys. I hope you've learned something from this, and as always, guys, thanks for stopping by the Aussie Shed. Always a pleasure to have you here. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and as always, I'll bloody well see you all on the next one. Cheers.